the basis of writing and publication is research. And you had a wonderful session on how it's done at different levels. I have been, as been said, probably the person who has had that the longest experience, and yet I can honestly say I learned something from every talk. And I think that's a high compliment, because methodology by itself is not exciting. But I think there was something in each talk that made it interesting. Doesn't matter what your background is. So let me begin by outlining, even before you write. I mean, the basis of publication is to have something to say. So then, once you have that, how do you write an article? And finally, the unavoidable handling of rejection. I'm afraid that's part of the trade. If you publish, you get rejected. It doesn't help with your personal life, but you learn how to handle publications. Now, first, have something to say that is valid, that is new, and that's important. And very few of the 20,000 published articles are valid, first of all, new, and most importantly, that they're important. So there is a surfeit of information. And my observation is that information grows exponentially, knowledge more slowly, and wisdom not at all. So there's still room for experience and reflection in addition to the evidence we can gather. Now, I'd like to share 3 premises, and I hope you agree. The really important research questions are those that matter to patients. For example, you go to a session where they're trying to do thrombectomy, and they're shaving time from intervention, and it hasn't been proven, but it may well be, and I hope that eventually it's shown that thrombectomy helps a proportion of patients. That's an important question. But it pales in comparison by a study that would organize the access of patients to a stroke unit, however basic it is. Because in my center, which is a sophisticated center, last time, I no longer do acute stroke, so I don't have the statistics. But even though we are proud of how quickly we can manage a patient, once they arrive in emergency, the average length of time for a patient to arrive in our emergency was 6 hours. Imagine that you organize a system whereby you educate the susceptible populations, you arrange for transportation. Sometimes it may be that ambulances are not the most effective. For example, in the head trauma literature, it has been found that if somebody is head injured at a side road, there's a way of transporting that person safely in cars, in just any car, and that makes a big difference. The question as to whether you can decrease the time at which someone has a stroke goes to emergency is a much more important question than whatever the answer is to whether thrombectomy is. And I remind you that most of you should be capable of making a difference at your center. Now, I use that as an example. And don't be hypnotized by the sophistication of what the research involves. And I like the statement that Dr. Broderick made this morning and said, it's essentially a scientific method. You make an observation, you make a hypothesis, and then you verify it or reject it. And so what you do is just as important as somebody who's playing around with cell cultures. You know, have a perspective. Everyone is a researcher, as I'll try to explain. Everything that we do can be improved. If you think you're perfect, then I don't want to talk to you, right? You aren't. There's no perfection. So anything you're doing, you can improve. If you decide to change one thing, evaluate at the beginning and evaluate at the end, that's research. And again, as Dr. Lindley said, it was Professor Dennis said, you know, the results of an audit may not be published in New England Journal of Medicine, but it's still important to your region. So in my opinion, everybody should be doing research, and everybody should be publishing, even if it's on a blog, because having to put something in writing disciplines you to put it more succinctly, and you learn from that experience. Now, building your strength. If you're an individual, you love mathematics, then my goodness, there are all sorts of opportunities of accessing databases. If on the other hand you're a great organizer and you can then address the question that I posed, and that is, can you improve the access of acute stroke patients to a stroke unit? Well, then use that strength. That's at the individual level. But then there must be centers at your disposal. Is your area one that has a large population that can be studied? Is it a unique population? You know, in some countries they have these genetic clusters. So in Newfoundland and Canada, they have many of the coast of Newfoundland is so rugged that if one ship arrived in one part of it, that population tended to intermarry. And we have all sorts of clusters of interesting neurological diseases, right? And so it's an example of how you may have also isolated populations that are genetically enriched, and you can be publishing something quite unique. And if you have a unique population, you probably can collaborate with sophisticated centers that can do the genetics for you. So keep that in mind. You may have a unique resource. And then, if you can, seek mentors and partners. You heard that research is a team sport, but also if you can somehow ask, you know, it's amazing how much you can get just by asking. If you know someone you respect in your center and you need some help, don't be afraid to ask. Chances are they'll help you. I mean, that's what people do. They want to educate the next generation. Now, we heard George Howard say, and some of these themes are coming in, some of the things I'm saying just repeats what you heard before. And Charles de Gaulle, who was a great eloquent orator, was asked one time, what are the figures of speech that explain your eloquence? He said there's only one figure of speech that works. Repetition, repetition, repetition. So, the message here is simplify. Thinking and working, multiplied by working, is always a constant. The more you think in a plan, the less you have to work. And do research as if you were lazy and had limited resources. And you'll be amazed how far you can get. I think the Edinburgh group is particularly good at that. I mean, look what they accomplished with the limited resources that they have. And Murphy's Law, if something can go wrong, it will. Be prepared. It's life. Clinical trials are part of life. Don't be surprised. And I think a very important thing that again was said before is have a stepwise design. You know, do all the thinking you can, then do a pilot. Sit down, look at it again, and then proceed. And if you can simplify the protocol after the initial experience, that's a big plus. Well, and again, this has been really discussed already, but I emphasize that if it's something is not valid, I don't care what you say about it. That's the first step, it has to be valid. And then is it new? Again, most research is copycat research. You know, when I was editor of Stroke, I rejected a paper on a particular subject. And then I said, well, how can you reject my paper? The series you published only had 500 cases. I have 800. And then I asked the question, what are your results different? Are they new? And the answer was no. So clearly, if a good study has been performed, don't waste your time duplicating it. Find something else to answer. And there are lots of unasked questions. And finally, does it matter to patients? That's my definition of important. Does it matter to patients? Well, I'm addressing this mainly to young people, but also to the young at mind. After all, it's not how old you are, it's how old is your latest original idea. So not knowing a field may be an advantage because you ask those fundamental questions that you think are ignorance, but you'll be surprised how many things that we assume to be true are not true. Once you acquire more knowledge, you may make the same assumptions and you've lost that freshness of first looking at the problem. So remember that you may have an advantage. You may not have the knowledge, but you may have the curiosity or the ability to ask some important questions. Now, some years ago, I did a survey among all my subspecialty colleagues in neurology, and I said, please list me the 6 most important mechanisms of your disease. Well, here they are. okay? Every major neurological disorder has these mechanisms to different degrees. And again, for opportunities to publish on something, I'd love to see a review article, a critical review article, that looks at what we can learn about inflammation in the brain from the MS people. They've been at it for decades. And if we only knew what we already know, for example, there was a drug that a company called Upjohn, now incorporated in one of the larger ones, that was supposed to decrease cholesterol levels. Now, it wasn't very effective, and it had an undesirable side effect. It produced hypothermia. Now, by now, that drug is out of patent, and there's a session in this Congress talking about the powers of hypothermia. The single best neuroprotectant of the brain is hypothermia. Imagine if we already knew about that drug when it was still under patent, we could have advanced quite a long way. So now, what I'm saying to you is that, there's a lot of opportunity for having new ideas, even at the level of a critical review, by looking at these interactive mechanisms. You could have inflammation. Well, I'll give you an example of MS, but it occurs in all major diseases, and there are drugs that do certain things in certain stages of those mechanisms. So I'm inviting you to take a look at the basic mechanisms and come up with some suggestions. I can assure you, if you send something novel to one of the leading stroke journals, they'll be quite interested in it. And then you can look at it and then try to get someone who is experienced or who has a name recognition to see whether they will evaluate for you critically. And chances are, if you're just starting in this field, there are enough changes that I think it'll be quite a decent thing to do is to invite them for co-authorship. And if you've done a good job, they'll be happy to join you. And you may get something published that's quite original at a very junior stage, or at least at a stage where you have not acquired the sophistication of a career in research. And similarly, there's a lot of opportunity when you go across specialties. Now, on your left is the homunculus as seen by a cardiologist, and on the right by a neurologist. And the difficulty is that cardiologists seldom venture above the neck, and the neurologists seldom dare to go below it. And yet, sudden death is a common problem. We have shown that sudden death is a common consequence of stroke, particularly if the injury is involved. Right? And 10% of heart failure patients die from sudden death. All the cardiologists look at the heart, but we know from the literature that the brain may have something to do with the heart. That has been well established. For example, in the finals of a European soccer game, football I think you call it in Europe, there were in excess of sudden deaths as compared to the previous year and the year after. They were all men, by the way. Women don't get that excited by soccer. And it turns out probably that if you have a heart condition and then you get hypersympathetic activity, you're more prone to atrial fibrillation. So we are beginning to look at this question in a more sophisticated way. But what I'm saying to you is that cardiology, which dominates the field of sudden death, has a guideline that was published about 4 years ago. I haven't looked at it recently. And in the 64 pages, I could not find a single specific allusion to the brain. Fantastic. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. So again, if you wanted to enter an area, an bridging area, then this is one of them, where you can actually contribute something new that has been looked at before. And now they have, imaging has now become common for stroke cases. I mean, even in low-resource countries, they have now these neat little loop recorders that you can wear for 2 weeks, and they're not invasive. So there are all sorts of opportunities that are looking at this interaction. And cardiac disease is commonly present in our patients and often the cause or the consequence of brain disease. Now, I don't know whether you're familiar with the expression big data. Essentially what it means is that there's so much information being generated that just by integrating what we know, we can have many answers, or if not answers, testable hypotheses to accelerate progress in our field. And if you want to get into the details of what I'm saying, you can look up an article that I published, the Willis Lecture in 2007. You can download it for free from the website of the journal Stroke. Now, the other thing you can take advantage of is what I'm calling neospective. And by this I mean asking a new question from existing data with new methodology. For example, there are dozens of studies to show increased incidence of dementia with increasing age. And similarly, a number of studies to show the increased incidence of stroke with increasing age. But we could not find, in the review of the literature, a good study that addressed whether having one represented risk for the other. So we took advantage of the Canadian Study for Health and Aging, which involved about 12,000 subjects, and the answer is quite clear. If a person over the age of 65 has a stroke, 64% of them will have some cognitive impairment. And if you ask the question the other way around, how many people with cognitive impairment, I'm talking now about the range, not just dementia, dementia will be the extreme of that, then 25% of them have a stroke. So clearly, they are associated. We cannot prove causality, but they're associated. So you can ask a number of questions, and you can use new methodologies. I was interested to hear the propensity scores. You know, it's one way of matching that can simulate a virtual clinical trial. Now, it's not as good as a clinical trial, but it can give you a good hypothesis to test. And the other methodology we're beginning to use is network analysis. Network analysis is basically the relationship of different nodes, a bit like the internet. And the beauty about that is that it makes no assumptions, and secondly, it handles very well nonlinear data, because more relationships in biology are nonlinear, and most of our statistics are linear, which make assumptions, which do not work at the extremes. So the other advantage of network analysis is that you can do virtual studies. For example, we showed that the right insula is dominant for sympathetic function. So if you have your studies on patients, you have their activation by fMRI, then you can make having the real data from patients, you can say, what if I knocked out the right insula? What would that produce to the rest of the network? And you'll come up with some hypothesis that you can then test on the next set of patients. So I'm sort of expanding your horizon to say you can ask new questions of existing data, and you can use methodologies that were not available when those data were acquired. Now, what are the short-term opportunities of getting published? Because it's a long process and it's an important one. The neospective studies I mentioned, you heard a wonderful analysis, how to do meta-analysis properly. And then reviews and commentaries are also, you can make shorter contributions by either being invited to or volunteering commentaries. Now, most uninvited commentaries are rejected, but if you have a good idea, I think most editors are open-minded. If you want to comment on something that is different, you may get published. And then controversies. I mean, there are lots of controversies, and some journals, like Stroke itself, has controversy sections. So if you suggest a controversy, you may get invited to be a participant of it. And then letters to the editor. Now, don't become a nuisance and write the same thing to every journal, but read carefully what's being published. And if you have an insight or a commentary that could be shared, then do try writing a letter to the editor. A letter to the editor, written concisely, can first of all put your name out there and actually make a contribution. You made a point that was not considered, say, in the original publication. Now, what about the long-term opportunities? This is a changed world. You probably know that they have what's now called massive open access courses. And from Harvard to the University of Toronto, to probably several of the Istanbul universities, they offer high-quality online courses for free. So you can learn about statistics, about epidemiology, about research design from anywhere in the world. And I think this is an opportunity that did not exist. And I would, as most of us here are clinicians, I believe, and I think that the basic science of clinical practice and research is clinical epidemiology. And I think that everyone should have basic training in research design and statistics, not that they would do it, but to learn how to communicate with the experts, as we've heard. And if you can possibly arrange it, go and visit good centers. You can, if you're in a developing country, sometimes it's not that expensive if you go on a holiday, the packages that they offer, but then skip the holiday and go to the center. And, most good centers welcome people, particularly if they're coming from countries where they have no opportunities. And then there are also formal opportunities. For example, there's a wonderful World Stroke Organization sponsored master's program, and we have a student here of that program, whereby you can actually get the training in stroke in the first instance, and probably also research. And I think these are they're competitive for sure, but they're also accessible. So I would encourage you to go to the website of the WSO and explore this master's degree in stroke. Now, so far I've talked about, the content of the article, because after all, that's the substance of it. But how should you write? I mean, writing is not easy. It really isn't, even for people who are gifted, because it has been said that easy writing is hard reading. So if you really want to communicate, you have to work very hard on how you express yourself. And here I've made an attempt. I've tried to boil down everything I have to say in one slide, right? And here it is. A good paper reports ethical, unbiased, valid, new and important facts, insights or interpretations in clear, concise, balanced language in the context of current knowledge and future steps. If you can do that, you'll get published. Now the pleasant part, rejection. Even at this stage in my life, I don't like to get rejections, and I still get them. So I try to be calm, to be a good example to the younger colleagues. Mm-hmm. However, it's just like handling stroke. Acute management, prognosis, rehabilitation, and then prevention. Prevention is best of it. They code in the code. By this I mean that when you get a letter, typically they use some phrase that gives you some idea what your chances are. So I'll go into that in a minute. Then, of course, then you have to decide if it's rejected, what you do, and finally, whether to appeal or not. I can tell you from experience of my own, and from the experience of many editors, because we used to have an association of editors of neurological journals, appeals are seldom justified. And they're seldom honored. And the reason is that oftentimes the reasons that are alleged for the appeal are not valid. For example, somebody said, those reviewers, they didn't say quite idiots, but they said, those reviewers, supposed to be expert, didn't get the point. Well, my dear author, if in 5,000 words you cannot convey the main message to experts, how do you expect it to convey to my readership? We're not experts. Goodbye, right? So in appeals, last resort. Okay, there are many other steps before that. Okay, the code in the code. I did start late, right, so I have time. Right? Yes. Expedite or reject, well, no explanation needed. Send it to another journal. Reject and resubmit as a full paper, or if they tell you as a brief report. I would say if they give you that chance, grab it. Even if you have to reduce your paper, because now they allow supplementary material to be published online. And you want to convey it to as many people as possible in the simplest way possible. So you still have the advantage of a larger publication by having a lot of the details put online as an appendix. And then, if it says accept with minor revision, certainly that means, do what they ask you and it's published. And accept, well, of course, let's see, there was one, in all my years I was associate editor of Archives of Neurology before I became editor of Stroke. And I was seeing probably tens of thousands of manuscripts. Well, there's thousands for sure. Well, yes, why not? With 3,000 per year for 10 years, that's, yes, tens of thousands of manuscripts. There's only one perfect paper that I have reviewed and seen reviewed. And that's by Hannah Damasio on the vascular anatomy of the brain. Perfect pictures, perfect prose, perfect message. So, the lesson there is, be prepared to revise your paper. I mean, no one is perfect. Most of the time, the suggestions are good ones. Now, if you get a rejection, but the opportunity to resubmit, well, address the reviewer's concerns. Now, it does not mean necessarily that you have to please the reviewer. I'll give you an example again. When I was editor of Stroke, I submitted something showing that being right-handed made you 5 times as likely to die from sudden death as compared to if you're left-handed or ambidextrous. And so one of the reviewers said, by the way, I didn't adjudicate my own paper, of course, it was reviewed by someone else. They said, well, we also know that sudden death can be influenced by medication. Have you looked at the medication of the 2,885 patients of the NACID study which we used? Well, I couldn't possibly. Can you just imagine going back when the study was completed and trying to look at all the charts and see what medication went? So my answer was this. I said, as far as I know, no one in the world prescribes according to handedness, and therefore there was no bias. And so they accepted the paper. So the point here is, you don't have to necessarily agree with the reviewer, as long as you can address the question. And can you counter what cannot be addressed? And I'll just give you an example. What are the odds? For the journal Stroke, if you had the paper rejected and invited to resubmit, 80% of those resubmitted papers got accepted. That's why I said earlier, if you get the chance to send back, just send it back as promptly as possible. Now, what about the rehabilitation part? Well, okay, it's rejected, and so what do you do? Seek advice. I mean, almost certainly your center will be someone with experience. Have them take a fresh look. They don't have to be an expert in the field. Just have them take a look. Secondly, can the results be improved? Sometimes doing an additional analysis or looking at the data again could strengthen the paper about something you didn't think about. And then finally, if there are enough changes, it's better, rather than trying to repair the manuscript, just take the main points and rewrite it. It's more likely to be fresh than having it all patched up by amendments. On prevention, you heard it before. Have something to say. Say it to the right audience. And say it succinctly, logically, and truthfully. And again, this is my summary. A good paper reports ethical, unbiased, valid, new and important facts, inside interpretations, in clear, concise, balanced language in the context of current knowledge and future steps. And finally, let me say a word for editors. Mark Twain, the American humorist, said that editors separate the grain from the chaff, and then they publish the chaff. But there's another side to that story. We editors are always looking for nuggets, But to find the nuggets, we have to really shift through a lot and lot of sand. So please, don't just send us sand. Send us your nuggets. So my final message to you is learning how to do research, learning how to write, and learning how to get published is a long apprenticeship. And the earlier you start, the further you go. So good luck.